Captain Rebecca Hayes had learned to swallow her pride with her morning coffee. Every day at 600 hours, she'd walk into the ready room at Nellis Air Force Base, pour herself a cup of bitter black fuel, and prepare for another round of subtle dismissals disguised as military courtesy. At 28, Rebecca had accumulated more flight hours than most pilots her age, but somehow that never seemed to matter. Her record spoke volumes, second in her flight school class, expert marksman. Certification and a flawless safety record spanning 4 years of active duty. Yet every morning brought the same reality. She was the only woman in Squadron 447, and that fact hung over every conversation like desert heat. The squadron's commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, was a 25-year veteran who wore his experience-like armor. He had the kind of weathered face that belonged in recruiting posters, complete with steel gray eyes that seemed to see through everything, except, apparently, Rebecca's capabilities. Webb wasn't overtly hostile. He was worse. He was dismissive in that perfectly professional way that made it impossible to file a complaint. "Hayes," he'd say during briefings, barely glancing her way, "you'll be running surveillance today. Keep those eyes sharp and report anything unusual." While her male counterparts received strike missions and combat training exercises, Rebecca found herself relegated to reconnaissance flights and support roles. The other pilots followed Webb's lead without question. Captain Derek Martinez, the squadron's golden boy, would flash his practiced smile whenever Rebecca entered a room, but his jokes always seemed to have an edge. "Hope you remembered to pack your reading glasses, Hayes. Wouldn't want you to miss anything important up there." The laughter that followed felt like a door slamming shut. Lieutenant Brad Thompson was worse. He didn't even bother with fake courtesy. He'd openly question her presence during tactical discussions, suggesting that maybe she'd be more comfortable handling administrative duties. When Rebecca would offer strategic insights based on her reconnaissance flights, Thompson would nod politely and then repeat the same suggestion as if it were his own idea. But it was Captain Ryan Foster who delivered the most cutting remarks. Foster had been passed over for promotion twice, and he seemed to blame everyone but himself. "Must be nice having special treatment," he'd mutter when Rebecca's name appeared on any desirable assignment. "Some of us actually have to earn our spots." The worst part wasn't the comments. It was the silence that followed them. No one ever spoke up. No one ever told Foster to knock it off or reminded Thompson that she'd outperformed him in simulation exercises. The silence was complicity, and it cut deeper than any insult. Rebecca's sanctuary was her F-16. Once she was strapped into that cockpit, surrounded by instruments and gauges that responded to skill rather than gender, she could breathe. The aircraft didn't care about squadron politics or old boys' networks. It responded to precision, preparation, and instinct, qualities she possessed in abundance. She'd developed habits that set her apart from her peers. While others relied heavily on automated systems, Rebecca insisted on manual cross-checks. She studied meteorological reports like scripture and memorized backup procedures that most pilots skimmed over. Her pre-flight inspections were legendary in their thoroughness, earning her the unofficial nickname Checklist among the ground crew. Chief Master Sergeant Williams, the squadron's senior enlisted advisor, was one of the few people who seemed to notice her dedication. "That girl knows her aircraft inside and out," he'd tell anyone who'd listen. "Treats that bird like it's made of gold." But Williams was career military. He understood the unspoken rules about staying in one's lane. That breaking point seemed inevitable, building pressure like a storm system moving across the desert. Rebecca could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the way her suggestions were consistently overlooked during mission planning, in the way Colonel Webb's eyes seemed to look right through her during briefings. 3. Weeks before everything changed, Rebecca overheard a conversation that crystallized her situation. She'd returned early from a training flight and was walking past the squadron office when Foster's voice carried through the partially open door. "I'm telling you, Webb, it's a liability. She's going to freeze up when things get real, and then what? We lose an aircraft, maybe worse, because someone was trying to make a political statement." Webb's response was measured, professional. "Captain, Foster, Hayes has performed adequately in all her assignments. Adequately isn't good enough when bullets start flying, Foster pressed. Look, I'm not saying she can't fly, but there's a difference between flying and fighting, and when push comes to shove, she'll fold. They always do. Rebecca stood frozen in the hallway, her flight bag heavy in her hand. Thompson's voice joined the conversation. Foster's got a point, sir. Maybe it's time to consider transferring her to a more suitable position. Training command, maybe. Or logistics. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. Finally, Webb spoke. I'll take your concerns under advisement, gentlemen. That's all for now. As footsteps approached the door, Rebecca quickly moved down the hallway, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and determination. She had always known this was how they saw her, but hearing it spoken so plainly was like taking a punch to the gut. That night, alone in her quarters, Rebecca stared at the framed photo of her father in his Navy flight suit. Commander James Hayes had died in a training accident when she was 12, but his words still echoed in her mind. Respect isn't given, sweetheart, it's earned, and sometimes you have to earn it more than once. She pulled out her training manuals and began studying. With renewed intensity. If they wanted to test her, she'd be ready. If they thought she'd fold under pressure, they were about to learn otherwise. The storm was coming, and Rebecca Hayes intended to be the one left standing when the dust settled. The mission briefing on Tuesday morning felt different. Colonel Webb stood at the front of the ready room, his usual commanding presence somehow more intense than usual. Behind him, the large tactical display showed a complex training scenario, Operation Desert Shield, a multi-squadron exercise designed to simulate real combat conditions. Gentlemen, Webb began, his eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on Rebecca, and lady, this is what we've been training for. Joint operations with the 64th Aggressor Squadron, live fire exercises, and electronic warfare simulation. This is as close to the real thing as we get without leaving Nevada. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of mission she'd been preparing for. Complex, challenging, requiring every skill she'd honed over 4 years of service. She leaned forward, ready to absorb every detail. Webb continued outlining the mission parameters. 3-day exercise, rotating flight schedules, both air-to-air and air-to-ground scenarios. When he reached the pilot assignments, Rebecca held her breath. Strike Team Alpha. Martinez, lead. Foster, wingman. Thompson, reserve. Webb's pointer moved across the tactical display. Strike Team Beta. Morrison, lead. Jackson, wingman. Peterson, reserve. Rebecca waited. Her name had to be coming up. This was too big an operation to leave anyone out. Support operations, Webb continued, and Rebecca's heart sank. Hayes, you'll be running AWACS coordination from the ground station. Electronic surveillance and communication relay. The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Rebecca felt every eye in the room on her, waiting for her reaction. She kept her expression neutral, professional, even as disappointment burned in her chest like jet fuel. Sir, she said, her voice steady, I'd like to request active flying. Status for this operation. My flight hours and performance ratings qualify me for strike team assignment. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Hayes, AWACS coordination is a critical role. The success of this entire operation depends on accurate intelligence and communication relay. I understand that, sir, but nothing, Captain. Webb's voice carried a warning edge. The assignments are final. Unless you have questions about your specific duties, we'll move on. Foster couldn't resist. Don't worry, Hayes. Someone's got to keep the coffee warm while we're up there doing the real work. The comment drew scattered chuckles from around the room. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists under the table, but she kept her voice level. Colonel Webb, respectfully, I've logged more simulation hours than any pilot in this room except Martinez. My technical scores exceed squadron averages in every category. I'm requesting an explanation for why I'm being excluded from active flight operations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Webb stepped closer to Rebecca's seat, his voice low and controlled. Captain Hayes, you're not being excluded. You're being assigned where your skills are most needed. AWACS coordination requires attention to detail and steady nerves, qualities that are essential for mission success. The implication was clear. She wasn't trusted with the dangerous work. Thompson shifted in his seat, exchanging a glance with Foster that spoke volumes. They were enjoying this. Sir, with respect, every pilot in the squadron has AWACS training. I'm the only one being assigned exclusively to ground operations for a flight exercise. Webb's eyes hardened. Captain Hayes, are you questioning my judgment? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca knew she was standing at a crossroads. Back down now, and she'd never be taken seriously again. Push back, and she'd be labeled as insubordinate. No, sir. I'm requesting clarification of the criteria used for mission assignments. The criteria, Webb said slowly, are experience, reliability, and mission requirements. This conversation is over, Captain. Report to the communication center at Agro 500. Tomorrow for equipment briefing. As the meeting dispersed, Rebecca remained in her seat, staring at the tactical display. The exercise she'd dreamed of participating in was happening without her. Around her, the other pilots chatted excitedly about aircraft loadouts and attack vectors. Martinez paused by her chair. For a moment, she thought he might say something supportive. Instead, he offered a patronizing smile. Don't take it personally, Hayes. Someone's got to handle the technical stuff. Not everyone can be a fighter pilot. After the room emptied, Chief Master Sergeant Williams approached her. He glanced around to make sure they were alone before speaking quietly. Captain, if it means anything, I think you're getting a raw deal. Rebecca looked up at him, surprised by the support. Thanks, Chief, but it doesn't change anything. Williams hesitated, then leaned closer. Maybe not directly, but electronics warfare scenarios can be unpredictable. Systems fail, communications break down. Sometimes the person monitoring everything sees things others miss. There was something in his tone, a suggestion that made Rebecca's tactical mind start working. What are you saying, Chief? I'm saying that AWACS operators sometimes end up being the most important person in the exercise, especially when things go wrong. Williams straightened up, his voice returning to normal volume. Get some rest, Captain. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. That evening, Rebecca sat in her quarters with her laptop, pulling up every technical manual she could find on electronic warfare systems. If Webb wanted her on the ground, she'd be the best AWACS operator in the history of the Air Force. But more than that, she'd be ready for whatever Williams had been hinting at. She studied frequency patterns, jamming techniques, and system vulnerabilities, until her eyes burned. If the boys wanted to play in the sky while she stayed earthbound, fine. But she'd make sure she knew more about what was happening up there than any of them. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes the person watching the whole battlefield sees opportunities that the fighters miss. Rebecca closed her laptop and stared out the window at the desert night. Tomorrow she'd show them exactly what she was capable of, even if it wasn't from 30,000 feet. The communication center buzzed with pre-dawn activity as Rebecca arrived at 04:45 hours, 15 minutes early as always. Banks of monitors lined the walls, displaying radar feeds, weather patterns, and aircraft telemetry. This would be her domain for the next 3 days, a high-tech prison with a perfect view of everyone else having the career she wanted. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, a communications specialist with 8 years of experience, greeted Rebecca with a knowing look. First time running AWACS for a major exercise, Captain? First time being forced into it, Rebecca replied, then caught herself. Sorry, Sergeant. That was unprofessional. Park smiled. No need to apologize, ma'am. Word gets around. We all know. You should be up there with them. She gestured toward the main display showing the pre-flight positions. But their loss is our gain. Most pilots treat ground support like an afterthought. Nice to have someone who actually understands what we're doing down here. Rebecca found herself genuinely warming to Park. Finally, someone who didn't seem to think her gender determined her capabilities. What's your read on the exercise parameters? Officially? Standard electronic warfare simulation with the 64th playing opposition force. Park's voice dropped slightly. Unofficially, Scuttlebutt says the 64th has some new jamming equipment they're dying to test. Should make things interesting. At 600 hours, the pilots began their final briefings in the adjacent ready room. Through the reinforced glass window, Rebecca could see Webb addressing the strike teams. Foster and Thompson flanked Martinez, all three looking confident and eager. The camaraderie was obvious. Inside jokes, shoulder slaps, the easy familiarity of men who never questioned their place in the hierarchy. "Strike Team Alpha, you're cleared for takeoff," Rebecca announced into her headset as the first wave of aircraft taxied toward the runway. Martinez's voice crackled back. "Copy that, ground control. Try to keep up down there." More laughter over the comm system. Rebecca gritted her teeth and focused on her monitors. The first 2 hours proceeded normally. Strike teams rotated through attack scenarios while the 64th Aggressor Squadron played the role of enemy forces. Rebecca coordinated communications, tracked aircraft positions, and monitored electronic signatures with mechanical precision. Then, at 0847 hours, something shifted. "Ground control, this is Strike Alpha Lead." Martinez's voice carried a note of concern. "I'm showing intermittent radar contacts bearing 030. Can you confirm?" Rebecca studied her displays. The contacts were there, faint, flickering in and out of detection range. "Alpha Lead, I show 3 possible contacts at your bearing, but they're not consistent. Could be atmospheric interference." "Negative. Ground. Control. These look deliberate. Possible jamming attempt." Park leaned over Rebecca's shoulder, pointing at a secondary monitor. "Captain, look at the frequency analysis. Those aren't random signals." Rebecca's pulse quickened. The 64th was testing their new equipment, just as Park had suggested. The electronic signatures were sophisticated, designed to confuse and disorient, but there was a pattern. Subtle, but definitely there. "Alpha Lead, recommend you adjust to frequency 127.5 and switch to manual targeting. I'm reading active jamming on your primary channels. Copy that, ground control." Martinez's voice was tighter now. "Switching to manual, over the next hour." The situation escalated. The 64th's jamming became more aggressive, more sophisticated. One by one, the strike teams began reporting system difficulties, navigation errors, targeting failures, communication blackouts. "Ground control, this is Beta 2! Thompson's voice crackled with static. "I've lost primary navigation. Request vector to home base." Rebecca checked her plot board. Thompson was 15 miles off course and climbing into restricted airspace. "Beta 2, immediate turn to heading 240. Descend to flight level 200. You're approaching the boundary." "Say again, ground control? Heavy interference on this channel." Rebecca tried multiple frequencies, but the jamming was intensifying. She watched helplessly as Thompson's aircraft continued on its dangerous trajectory. If he hit the restricted zone, the exercise would be terminated, and there would be serious consequences. "Sergeant Park, can we boost signal strength on emergency frequencies?" "Already at maximum, Captain. Whatever they're using is more powerful than anything I've seen." Rebecca made a decision that would have career implications. She activated the emergency override protocol, cutting through the jamming with a high-powered directional transmission that technically violated exercise parameters. "Beta 2, this is ground control on emergency frequency. Turn immediately to heading 240, descend to flight level 200. You are approaching restricted airspace." Thompson's response was barely audible. "Copy. Turning." The aircraft slowly adjusted. Course, moving away from the danger zone. Rebecca had prevented a potential disaster, but she'd also broken protocol. The review board would have questions. 30 minutes later, Foster's voice erupted over the comm system. "Ground control, what the hell's going on down there? My targeting system just reset itself. Strike Team Charlie Lead, your aircraft are experiencing electronic countermeasures. Recommend manual systems and visual targeting." "Manual systems? This is supposed to be a modern warfare exercise, not World War II. Rebecca bit back her response. Foster's attitude was making a dangerous situation worse. His frustration was bleeding through to the other pilots, creating confusion and panic where there should have been professional adaptation. "All aircraft, this is ground control," Rebecca announced on the main frequency. "Electronic countermeasures are part of the exercise parameters. Recommend all pilots switch to backup systems and manual navigation. I'll provide vectors as needed." Foster's response was venomous. "Easy for you to say from your comfortable chair down there. Try flying blind at 500 knots and see how calm you are. The comment stung because it revealed the fundamental disconnect. To Foster and the others, she wasn't a pilot temporarily assigned to ground duty. She was ground personnel who happened to have a pilot's license. The distinction mattered more than she'd realized, but Rebecca had spotted something the others missed. The jamming pattern had a weakness, a brief window every 43 seconds where the signal dropped by 30%. It wasn't much, but it was enough for critical communications. All aircraft, I'm going to time-sync critical communications with signal breaks. Stand by for coordinated updates every 45 seconds. For the next 2 hours, Rebecca orchestrated the exercise like a conductor managing a complex symphony. She guided confused pilots around jamming zones, coordinated attack runs during signal breaks, and maintained situational awareness for 12 aircraft operating in increasingly hostile electronic environment. Her performance was flawless. Not a single aircraft strayed off course, no one entered restricted airspace, and the mission objectives were met despite the aggressive countermeasures. When the exercise concluded and the aircraft returned to base, Rebecca felt a quiet satisfaction. She'd proven her worth in a way that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Colonel Webb entered the communication center as she was completing her after-action report. His expression was unreadable. "Captain Hayes, I understand there were some irregularities in your communication protocols today." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. I used emergency override twice to prevent aircraft from entering restricted airspace. Full details are in my report." Webb studied her for a long moment. The exercise controllers were impressed with the ground coordination. They said it was some of the best AWACS work they'd seen in years. "Thank you, sir. However," Webb continued, "several pilots have expressed concerns about communication procedures. They felt your approach was overly aggressive." Rebecca almost laughed. She'd saved their careers by preventing serious violations, and they were complaining about her methods. "Noted, sir. Is there anything else?" Webb seemed to expect more, an apology, perhaps, or some acknowledgement of her place. Instead, Rebecca simply waited, her expression professional and patient. "Dismissed, Captain." As Rebecca gathered her materials, Park approached quietly. "Captain, that was some of the best tactical coordination I've ever seen. Don't let them make you think otherwise." Walking across the tarmac toward her quarters, Rebecca felt the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. She'd proven herself again, but somehow that just seemed to make things worse. Excellence, she was learning, could be its own form of isolation. Tomorrow was day 2 of the exercise, and she had a feeling the real test was just beginning. Day 2 of Operation Desert Shield began with an ominous development. Rebecca arrived at the communication center to find Colonel Webb waiting for her with a manila folder and an expression that promised trouble. "Captain Hayes, we need to discuss yesterday's performance." Rebecca maintained her composure despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Yes, sir. I've prepared a comprehensive after-action report." Webb opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be official complaint forms. "I've received formal grievances from 3 pilots regarding your communication procedures during yesterday's exercise." "Grievances, sir?" "Captain Foster alleges that your unauthorized frequency changes compromised his aircraft's targeting systems. Lieutenant Thompson claims your excessive communication created confusion during critical phases of the mission." Webb's voice carried the weight of administrative procedure. "Captain Martinez has expressed concerns about your deviation from standard protocols." Rebecca felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Sir, those deviations prevented 2 aircraft from entering restricted airspace and maintained communication during active jamming operations." "That's not the point, Captain. Military operations depend on adherence to established procedures, not individual interpretation of circumstances." The accusation hit like a physical blow. After 4 years of flawless service, her competence was being questioned because she'd done her job too well. "Colonel Webb, respectfully, my actions were within established emergency parameters and prevented potential violations that could have terminated the exercise." Webb closed the folder with deliberate finality. "Captain Hayes, you seem to have difficulty understanding your role in this organization. Yesterday's exercise was designed to test pilot adaptability under adverse conditions, not to showcase ground control capabilities. The subtext was crystal clear. She'd made the pilots look bad by solving problems they couldn't handle themselves. Your assignment for today's exercise has been modified, Webb continued. You'll be monitoring communication traffic only. No active coordination, no frequency management, no tactical guidance. Is that understood? Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. Sir, you're essentially removing me from meaningful participation in the exercise. I'm ensuring that today's operations proceed according to established protocols without complications. The word complications landed like a slap. Rebecca had spent her entire career following orders, exceeding expectations, and maintaining the highest standards of professionalism. Now she was being treated like a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. Colonel, I'm requesting to speak with the exercise director about these restrictions. Webb's eyes hardened. Captain Hayes, you're walking a very thin line. I suggest you remember your place in this organization and focus on the duties you've been assigned. As Webb left the communications center, Rebecca stood alone among the banks of monitors, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. She'd reached the breaking point, not with a dramatic explosion, but with quiet, cold clarity. Technical Sergeant Park arrived for her shift, immediately sensing the tension. Everything okay, Captain? Rebecca briefly explained the situation, watching Park's expression grow increasingly incredulous. They're benching you for doing your job too well? Park shook her head. That's the biggest load of... Sorry, ma'am. But that's ridiculous. It doesn't matter now. I'm just supposed to monitor and keep quiet. Park studied Rebecca for a moment, then glanced around to ensure they were alone. Captain, can I speak freely? Of course, Sergeant. I've been in communications for 8 years. I've worked with a lot of pilots, and most of them treat us like equipment, useful when they need us, invisible otherwise. Yesterday was different. You coordinated that exercise like you understood every aircraft, every pilot, every system involved. That's not something you see every day. Rebecca appreciated the support, but it couldn't change her reality. Thanks, Lisa. But understanding the systems doesn't matter if you're not allowed to use that knowledge. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Rebecca sat at her monitoring station, watching radar tracks and listening to radio chatter while being prohibited from participating. It was like being forced to watch a chess match she knew she could win while being forbidden to speak. At 10:30 hours, the situation began to deteriorate. The 64th Aggressor Squadron had upgraded their electronic warfare capabilities overnight, and the jamming was more sophisticated than anything from day one. Within minutes, the strike teams were struggling with system failures and communication blackouts. Ground control, this is Alpha Lead, Martinez's voice crackled with static. I've lost primary navigation and my wingman is off course. Request assistance. Rebecca watched the tactical display as Martinez's wingman, Lieutenant Peterson, drifted toward a mountainous area with minimum safe altitude restrictions. Her fingers hovered over the communication controls, but Webb's orders echoed. In her mind, monitor only. The duty controller, a young airman named Davis, was clearly overwhelmed. He'd been trained for standard operations, not sophisticated electronic warfare scenarios. Alpha Lead, stand by for vectors. Davis frantically consulted his charts, while Peterson's aircraft continued its dangerous drift. Rebecca could see exactly what needed to happen, a specific frequency change and precise heading correction, but she was forbidden from acting. Ground control, Peterson is not responding on any frequency, Martinez reported, tension evident in his voice. He's heading directly toward the Pintwater Range. Davis looked at Rebecca with panic in his eyes. Captain, what do I do? Rebecca felt the weight of impossible choices. Follow orders and potentially witness a disaster, or act against direct instructions to prevent it. The aircraft on her screen wasn't just a blip on radar, it was a person, a fellow pilot who deserved to come home safely. She made her decision. Airman Davis, step back. Rebecca activated the emergency frequency override, cutting through the jamming with a high-powered transmission. Beta 4, this is ground control emergency frequency. Turn immediately to heading 180, climb to flight level 250. You are approaching minimum safe altitude. Peterson's response was immediate. Copy ground control, turning to 180, climbing. The Atasana aircraft banked sharply away from the mountains, climbing to safe altitude. Crisis averted, but Rebecca knew the consequences would follow quickly. Less than 10 minutes later, Colonel Webb stormed into the communications center, his face flushed with anger. "Captain Hayes, what part of monitor only did you not understand?" Rebecca stood at attention, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Sir, Lieutenant Peterson was approaching minimum safe altitude in mountainous terrain. I prevented a potential emergency situation." "You directly disobeyed orders, Captain?" "I prevented a possible fatality, sir." Webb stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Captain Hayes, you have consistently demonstrated an inability to follow orders and respect authority. Your insubordination has become a pattern, and it ends now." The accusation of insubordination felt like a physical blow. Rebecca had never, in 4 years of service, been accused of failing to follow orders. Her record was spotless, her evaluations exemplary. But now, because she'd refused to be marginalized and had done her job when it mattered most, she was being painted as a problem. "Officer, sir, my record speaks for itself. I've never received anything less than exemplary ratings. Your record also shows a pattern of questioning authority and exceeding your assigned duties without authorization." Webb's words were clipped, final. "Effective immediately, you're relieved of all exercise duties. Report to my office at 1400 hours for administrative action." As Webb left, the communication center fell silent except for the hum of electronics. Davis looked at Rebecca with a mixture of admiration and sympathy. "Captain, you saved Peterson's life." "Yes," Rebecca replied quietly. "But apparently that's not what matters." Technical Sergeant Park approached cautiously. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, every person in this room knows you did the right thing." Rebecca nodded, but the support felt hollow. She'd reached the point where doing the right thing was grounds for punishment. The system wasn't just biased against her, it was actively hostile to her success. That afternoon, walking across the tarmac toward Webb's office, Rebecca felt something crystallize inside her. She'd spent 4 years trying to prove herself within a system that didn't want her to succeed. Every achievement had been minimized, every success questioned, every moment of excellence treated as evidence of her inability to follow orders. But she'd also learned something important. She was better at this job than the people trying to keep her from doing it. When systems failed and confusion reigned, she was the one who maintained control. When lives were at risk, she was the one who acted. As she reached Webb's office door, Rebecca made a decision. She would stop trying to prove herself to people who would never accept her. Instead, she would prove something far more important, that competence and courage speak louder than prejudice and politics. The real fight was about to begin. Rebecca sat in Colonel Webb's office, her posture rigid as he shuffled through paperwork with deliberate slowness. Behind him, commendation plaques and photos of aircraft formations created an ironic backdrop for what was clearly intended as career assassination. "Captain Hayes," Webb began without looking up, "your conduct during this exercise has been unacceptable. Insubordination, failure to follow direct orders, and disruption of training operations." He finally met her eyes. I'm recommending you for transfer to a position more suited to your capabilities." Rebecca felt her pulse steady rather than quicken. Something had shifted during her walk across the base, a cold clarity that came from finally understanding the game being played. "What position is that, sir?" "Training command, administrative duties. You'd be working with flight simulators and classroom instruction." Webb's slight smile revealed his satisfaction. "It would be a better fit for someone with your particular strengths." The implication was crystal clear. Get her out of operational flying and into a desk job where she couldn't embarrass the boys' club anymore. Rebecca had seen this move before. Promising female officers quietly shuffled into support roles where they could be ignored. "I see." Rebecca's voice remained steady. "And when would this transfer take effect?" "Pending administrative review, which I'll be initiating immediately." Webb leaned back in his chair. "Of course, if you're having second thoughts about your career in the Air Force, There are other options. Early separation, perhaps. With your technical background, I'm sure civilian aerospace companies would be interested. There it was, the not-so-subtle suggestion that she quit. Make the problem disappear quietly. Rebecca almost admired the elegance of it. I'd like to request a copy of my personnel file, sir, for review purposes. Webb's eyebrows rose slightly. That's unnecessary, Captain. Everything you need to know is in my recommendation. Nevertheless, sir, I'd like to review my complete record before responding to these allegations. Something in Rebecca's tone seemed to register with Webb. His casual confidence flickered for a moment. Very well, you can request it through normal channels. Thank you, sir. Will there be anything else? Webb studied her carefully, apparently expecting more of a reaction. You're dismissed, Captain. Rebecca saluted crisply and left the office, her mind already working through the implications. Webb had made a tactical error by putting his accusations in writing. If she could prove a pattern of discrimination, his recommendation would look less like professional judgment and more like retaliation. Her first stop was the base legal office where Captain Jennifer Torres, the staff judge advocate, greeted her with professional courtesy that seemed genuine rather than performative. Captain Hayes, what can I do for you? Rebecca explained the situation carefully, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional language. Torres listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. You're alleging discrimination based on gender? Torres asked when Rebecca finished. I'm documenting a pattern of differential treatment that appears to be related to gender. Yes, ma'am. Torres nodded slowly. That's a serious allegation. You understand that filing a formal complaint will require substantial documentation and could have significant career implications regardless of the outcome? I understand, ma'am, but I also understand that staying silent guarantees the outcome they want. Fair enough. Torres pulled out a thick folder. Let's start with your personnel records. I'll need documentation of your performance evaluations, training records, and any written communications regarding your assignments. Over the next 2 hours, Torres helped Rebecca compile a comprehensive picture of her service record. The contrast was stark. Exemplary performance ratings, superior technical scores, and flawless safety record, yet consistently relegated to support roles and excluded from career-advancing assignments. This is interesting, Torres said, studying. A training report. You ranked second in your flight school class, but your first operational assignment was reconnaissance rather than strike fighter. That's unusual for someone with your scores. I was told it was due to operational requirements, Rebecca replied. Torres made another note, and here, you requested fighter transition training 3 times over 2 years. Each request was denied, for administrative reasons. But Lieutenant Thompson, who graduated 7th in your class, was approved for transition training after only 6 months of operational duty. The pattern was becoming undeniable when documented systematically. What had felt like isolated incidents of bias revealed themselves as a coordinated effort to limit her advancement. Captain Hayes, this is compelling evidence, but you need to understand something, Torres said seriously. Filing this complaint will make you a target. Even if you win, there will be career consequences. Are you prepared for that? Rebecca thought about her conversation with Peterson after she'd guided him away from the mountains. He'd thanked her privately, admitting that he'd been completely disoriented by the jamming. None of the other pilots had acknowledged what she'd done, but Peterson at least recognized that she'd saved his career, if not his life. Ma'am, I became a target the day I walked into this squadron. At least now I'll be fighting back. Torres smiled for the first time during their meeting. In that case, let's make sure we do this right. The next morning, Rebecca implemented the second phase of her strategy. She'd spent the night researching Air Force regulations and discovered something interesting. The electronic warfare exercise had specific protocols for communication procedures during jamming operations. Protocols that explicitly authorized ground controllers to use all necessary means to maintain aircraft safety. She requested a meeting with the exercise director, Colonel Patricia Williams, a veteran pilot who had successfully navigated her own career in a male-dominated field. Williams agreed to see her that afternoon. Captain Hayes, I understand you have concerns about your role in the current exercise. Rebecca presented her case methodically. She documented the specific jamming incidents, her responses, and the outcomes. Most importantly, she showed how her actions had prevented potential safety violations and maintained mission integrity. "Interesting," Williams said, reviewing the technical data. "Your frequency management during the jamming sequences was quite sophisticated. How did you identify the signal gaps?" "Pattern analysis, ma'am. The jamming system had a regular reset cycle that created brief windows of reduced interference." Williams looked up from the reports. "Captain, are you aware that the 64th Aggressor Squadron specifically requested feedback on their new jamming capabilities? Your analysis would be valuable for their system development." Rebecca felt a spark of hope. "I'd be happy to provide a detailed technical assessment, ma'am. More than that," Williams continued, "I'm recommending you for the Advanced Electronic Warfare course at Eglin Air Force Base. It's a 6-month program that leads to certification as an electronic warfare officer." She paused meaningfully. "It's also a fast track to squadron leadership positions." The irony wasn't lost on Rebecca. By trying to sideline her, Webb had inadvertently showcased skills that made her valuable in an entirely different way. Electronic warfare was a rapidly expanding field, and officers with both pilot training and technical expertise were in high demand. "There's one more thing," Williams added. "The final day of this exercise includes a scenario specifically designed to test communication resilience during catastrophic jamming. Based on your performance so far, I'm recommending you as lead ground controller for that phase." Rebecca felt pieces of a larger strategy falling into place. "Will Colonel Webb approve that assignment?" Williams smiled grimly. "Colonel Webb doesn't have authority over exercise assignments. I do." That evening, Rebecca called her mentor from flight school, Major Sandra Collins, who now worked at the Pentagon in personnel assignments. After explaining the situation, Collins was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca, I've been waiting for a call like this for years. There's something you need to know. You're not the first promising female pilot to have performance issues under Webb's command." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. There have been others? 3 in the past 5 years. All excellent pilots, all transferred out after conflicts with squadron leadership. But here's the thing. 2 of them are now flying for major airlines, and 1 is a test pilot for Boeing. Their careers weren't destroyed, they were just forced to find them elsewhere. Why didn't anyone report this pattern? Because until now, no one had the documentation to prove it. Your legal officer, Torres, called me today. She's building a case that could change how these situations are handled service-wide. Collins paused, then continued with obvious satisfaction. "There's something else you should know. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force is a woman, General Patricia Rodriguez. She's been looking for test cases to address systemic discrimination issues. Your situation has made it to her attention." Rebecca felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. What had started as a personal struggle was becoming something much larger, a chance to change the system for the women who would follow. "What do I need to do?" "Keep documenting everything, perform flawlessly in whatever assignments you get, and be prepared for the fact that change often comes with a price." The next morning brought an unexpected development. Technical Sergeant Park approached Rebecca before the daily briefing with unusual urgency. "Captain, you need to see this." Park handed her a printed email. "I wasn't supposed to see it, but it was accidentally sent to the Communication Center's shared folder." Rebecca scanned the message, her anger building with each line. It was from Foster to Thompson and Martinez. "Operation is working perfectly. Hayes is about to be transferred out, and we can get back to normal operations. Webb says the paperwork should be finalized by next week. Finally won't have to deal with diversity hire bullshit anymore." The casual cruelty of it was stunning, but Rebecca felt oddly calm. They'd just provided the smoking gun that would make Torres's case ironclad. "Sergeant Park, did anyone else see this?" "Half the communication center, ma'am. People are pretty disgusted." Rebecca made copies of the email and secured the original. Her opponents had just made a fatal error. They'd put their discrimination in writing and distributed it to witnesses. As she walked toward the ready room for the morning briefing, Rebecca felt a strange sense of liberation. For 4 years she'd been fighting an invisible enemy, trying to prove herself against unspoken biases and hidden agendas. Now the enemy had revealed itself, and the battlefield was finally clear. Colonel Webb began his briefing with obvious satisfaction. Today's exercise will test pilot adaptability under extreme electronic warfare conditions. Captain Hayes will be observing from the communication center under supervision. Rebecca stood up. Sir, I've been reassigned by the exercise director to lead ground controller for today's jamming resilience scenario. Webb's face went through several shades of red. That's impossible. Sir, Colonel Williams provided written orders yesterday afternoon. Rebecca handed him the official directive. I believe you'll find everything in order. As Webb read the orders, his jaw clenched visibly. Around the room, she could see the other pilots processing this development with obvious discomfort. Their plan to sideline her had just been overruled by higher authority. Very well, Webb said finally, but any deviations from protocol will result in immediate removal from duty. Rebecca smiled calmly. Understood, sir. I'll be sure to follow all authorized procedures. As the briefing concluded and pilots headed toward their aircraft, Rebecca felt the eyes of every person in the room on her. But for the first time in months, those looks weren't dismissive or condescending. They were wary. The hunters had just realized they'd been stalking a predator. Today's exercise would be her chance to prove not just her competence, but her superiority. And with Torres building a legal case, Collins working the Pentagon angles, and Williams providing operational support, Rebecca finally had the backing she needed to fight back effectively. The real battle was about to begin, and this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. The morning of the final exercise dawned with unusual tension crackling through Nellis Air Force Base. Rebecca arrived at the communications center to find it bustling with activity, twice the normal personnel, multiple recording devices, and several observers in dress uniforms she didn't recognize. Colonel Williams approached her with a briefing folder. Captain Hayes, today's scenario is more complex than previous exercises. We have representatives from Air Combat Command and the Pentagon observing, specifically to evaluate our electronic warfare capabilities. Rebecca felt the weight of scrutiny, but also opportunity. Understood, ma'am. What are the specific parameters? The 64th Aggressor Squadron will be using their most advanced jamming systems, simulating near-peer adversary capabilities. Your job is to maintain operational control of 12 aircraft through what will essentially be electronic chaos. Williams paused meaningfully. Failure to maintain communication and control could result in simulated casualties and mission failure. As Williams walked away, Technical Sergeant Park approached with barely contained excitement. Captain, you need to know, word came down from Wing Command. They specifically requested you for this exercise after reviewing yesterday's performance data. The implications were staggering. Someone at the highest levels had been watching, evaluating, and had apparently been impressed. Rebecca felt a mixture of vindication and pressure. At 800 hours, the pilots assembled for final briefing. Colonel Webb's demeanor had shifted from confident dismissal to barely controlled frustration. The appearance of senior observers had clearly disrupted whatever plans he'd made for Rebecca's career. Today's exercise represents the most challenging electronic warfare scenario you'll face, Webb announced. Ground control will be, he paused, visibly struggling with the words, Captain Hayes, operating under direct observation from air. Combat Command. Foster's jaw tightened at this announcement. Thompson exchanged glances with Martinez, their earlier confidence evaporating. The casual dismissal they'd shown Rebecca for months was impossible to maintain when senior Air Force leadership was specifically watching her performance. As the pilots filed out for aircraft preparation, Foster lingered. Hayes, he said quietly, don't think this changes anything. One exercise doesn't erase 4 years of facts. Rebecca met his gaze steadily. You're right, Captain. 4 years of facts are about to become very relevant. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Foster's expression darkened as he realized she knew about the email. His conspiracy wasn't as secret as he'd believed. By 900 hours, the aircraft were airborne and the electronic warfare had begun. The 64th's jamming was immediately more sophisticated than anything Rebecca had encountered. Communications failed within minutes, navigation systems produced false readings, and targeting computers locked onto phantom signals. Ground control, this is Alpha Lead. Martinez's voice crackled through heavy static. All primary systems compromised. Request immediate assistance. Rebecca's fingers moved across her control panel with practiced precision. She'd spent the previous evening studying the jamming signatures, identifying patterns, and developing countermeasures. Alpha lead, switch to frequency 251.7. Encryption mode Charlie. Broadcast in 15-second bursts only. The response came through clearly. Copy, ground control, switching frequencies. One by one, Rebecca re-established contact with the scattered aircraft, but this was only the beginning. The 64th's jamming intensified, creating a cascading series of system failures that threatened to turn the exercise into a disaster. Ground control, this is Beta 3, Thompson's voice carried genuine panic. I've lost all navigation. I can't see the other aircraft. Request immediate vector to safe airspace. Rebecca checked her displays. Thompson was flying blind in a congested exercise area with multiple aircraft maneuvering nearby. A collision was possible, potentially catastrophic even in a training scenario. Beta 3, turn immediately to heading 090. Descend to flight level 150. Maintain that heading until I give you further guidance. Turning to 090, descending, Thompson replied, his earlier antagonism replaced by desperate gratitude. In the observation booth, she could see the senior officers watching intently. Colonel Williams was pointing at various displays, explaining Rebecca's tactical decisions to a two-star general she didn't recognize. For the next 90 minutes, Rebecca orchestrated the most complex electronic warfare exercise in Nellis history. She guided lost aircraft through jamming fields, coordinated attack runs using backup communication systems, and maintained situational awareness for 12 pilots operating essentially blind. The breakthrough came when she identified a critical vulnerability in the 64th's jamming system. By carefully timing communication bursts with specific frequency changes, she could create brief windows of clear transmission. It required split-second timing and perfect coordination, but it worked. All aircraft, this is ground control, she announced during one of these windows. I'm implementing synchronized communication protocol. All transmissions will be coordinated through ground control on specific time intervals. Follow my lead. The result was flawless. Despite the most sophisticated jamming environment they'd ever encountered, Rebecca maintained perfect control throughout the exercise. Not a single aircraft strayed off course, no one entered restricted airspace, and all mission objectives were met. When the exercise concluded and the aircraft returned to base, the communication center erupted in spontaneous applause from the technical staff. But Rebecca's attention was focused on the observation booth, where the senior officers were engaged in intense discussion. Colonel Webb entered the communication center looking like a man facing execution. Behind him walked the two-star general, whose expression was unreadable. Captain Hayes, the general said, I'm General Patricia Rodriguez, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Rebecca came to attention immediately. General Rodriguez, ma'am. Captain, what I witnessed today was exceptional air traffic control under the most challenging conditions possible. Your performance prevented what could have been multiple emergency situations. Rodriguez paused, studying Rebecca carefully. I understand. There have been some administrative issues regarding your assignments. Webb stepped forward. General, Captain Hayes has shown improvement, but there have been concerns about her ability to follow. Colonel Webb, Rodriguez interrupted coldly. I've reviewed, Captain. Hayes's complete personnel file, including recent documentation provided by the Staff Judge Advocate's office. Her tone carried unmistakable warning. Those concerns appear to be unfounded. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Webb's face went ashen as he realized his situation had fundamentally changed. Rodriguez turned back to Rebecca. Captain, I'm personally recommending you for immediate promotion to major and assignment as an electronic warfare systems instructor at the Air Force Academy. Your technical expertise and operational experience make you uniquely qualified for that position. Rebecca felt the world shift around her. Not only was she escaping Webb's retaliation, she was being elevated far beyond anything she dared hope for. There's one more thing, Rodriguez continued, looking directly at Webb. The Air Force is conducting a comprehensive review of assignment, practices, and leadership effectiveness at the squadron level. I expect full cooperation with that investigation. Webb's career had just ended, and everyone in the room knew it. His pattern of discrimination would be exposed, documented, and become a case study for exactly the kind of leadership the modern Air Force was determined to eliminate. As the senior officers left, Rebecca found herself alone with Webb for a moment. He looked at her with undisguised hatred. "You think you've won something here, Hayes?" Rebecca's response was quiet, professional, devastating. "Colonel, I think the Air Force just won something. The question is whether you understand what you've lost." That evening, as Rebecca packed her belongings in preparation for her new assignment, she reflected on how completely the situation had reversed. 4 months ago, she'd been fighting for basic recognition. Now she was being personally mentored by the Chief of Staff and moving to one of the most prestigious positions in the Air Force. Her phone rang. It was Major Collins from the Pentagon. "Rebecca, congratulations on your promotion. But there's something else you should know. Your case has been selected as the primary example for new anti-discrimination training that will be implemented Air Force-wide." Rebecca smiled. Her fight hadn't just saved her own career, it was going to protect every woman who followed. The hunter had become the teacher, and the lesson would echo through the Air Force for years to come. The formal investigation hearing convened 3 weeks later in a sterile conference room at Nellis Air Force Base. Rebecca sat at a polished oak table flanked by Captain Torres and Major Collins, who had flown in specifically for the proceedings. Across from them, Colonel Webb sat with his military defense counsel, looking like a man who'd aged years in the span of weeks. General Rodriguez presided over the hearing alongside Colonel Sarah Henderson from the Inspector General's office and Colonel Michael Chen from Air Force Personnel Command. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. This hearing would establish precedent for how the Air Force handled systemic discrimination cases. This hearing is convened to investigate allegations of discrimination and retaliation against Captain Rebecca Hayes, General Rodriguez announced. "Colonel Webb, you are accused of systematically excluding Captain Hayes from career-advancing assignments based on gender bias and subsequently retaliating against her when she demonstrated superior performance." Webb's defense attorney, Major Kyle Harrison, stood to address the panel. "General Rodriguez, my client has served with distinction for 25 years. Colonel Webb's assignment decisions were based solely on operational requirements and his professional judgment regarding pilot capabilities." Torres rose to present Rebecca's case. "Generals, I will demonstrate through documented evidence that Colonel Webb engaged in a deliberate pattern of discrimination that violated both Air Force regulations and federal law." The first witness was Chief Master Sergeant Williams, whose testimony established the baseline of Rebecca's exceptional technical knowledge and flight performance. "Ma'am, in my 23 years of service, I've rarely seen a pilot with Captain Hayes' combination of technical expertise and operational skill. Her aircraft knowledge exceeds that of most instructors." Major Harrison attempted to undermine Williams's testimony. "Chief Williams, isn't it true that technical knowledge doesn't necessarily translate to combat effectiveness?" Williams fixed him with a steady gaze. "Sir, when systems fail and confusion reigns, technical knowledge is what keeps pilots alive. Captain Hayes proved that during the electronic warfare exercise." The second witness devastated Webb's defense. Lieutenant Peterson took the stand and described in detail how Rebecca's communication guidance had saved him from a potentially fatal flight into mountainous terrain. "She identified my position, calculated my trajectory, and provided precise navigation instructions that prevented me from crashing," Peterson testified. "I was completely disoriented by the jamming, flying blind, and dangerous terrain. Without her intervention, I would have died." Major Harrison's cross-examination was weak. "Lieutenant Peterson, isn't it possible you could have recovered without ground assistance?" "No, sir, absolutely not. I had no idea where I was or which direction was safe. Captain Hayes saved my life." But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant Park had been subpoenaed to testify about communication center operations, but her testimony revealed something more significant. "I heard multiple conversations where Captain Foster and others discussed their intention to force Captain Hayes out of the squadron," Park testified. "They specifically said they were tired of dealing with diversity hire bullshit and wanted to get back to normal operations." Torres presented the infamous email as evidence. This communication, sent by Captain Foster and copied to multiple squadron members, explicitly refers to Captain Hayes as a diversity hire and celebrates the planned to transfer her out of operational flying. Webb's attorney objected. "This email was not sent by my client." "No," Torres replied, "but Colonel Webb created the environment where such attitudes were not only tolerated but encouraged. This email represents the logical outcome of his leadership." "Style." General Rodriguez leaned forward. "Colonel Webb, were you aware of the attitudes expressed in this email?" Webb's response was defensive. "General, I cannot be responsible for every private communication between junior officers." "But you can be responsible for the command climate you create," Rodriguez replied coldly, "a climate where female officers are routinely excluded from meaningful assignments and where discrimination is discussed openly suggests a failure of leadership at the highest level." Torres then presented the statistical analysis that definitively proved discrimination. Over the past 4 years under Colonel Webb's command, qualified female pilots were assigned to support roles at a rate 3 times higher than their male counterparts with equivalent qualifications. Captain Hayes, despite ranking in the top 5% of all pilots by technical scores, was never assigned to a primary strike mission until she was specifically requested by outside authority. The evidence was overwhelming, but the climactic moment came when General Rodriguez asked Webb to explain his own words. "Colonel Webb, you were recorded during a meeting with junior officers stating that female pilots would fold when bullets. Start flying and questioning whether they belonged in combat roles. How do you explain these statements?" Webb's composure finally cracked. "General, with respect, combat aviation has always been a male-dominated field for good reasons. The physical and psychological demands—" "Colonel," Rodriguez interrupted, "Captain Hayes just demonstrated superior performance under the most demanding conditions your squadron has ever faced. She maintained control when every other system failed. Your male pilots, whom you deemed more capable, required her guidance to complete their missions safely." The silence that followed was deafening. Webb had no answer because there was no answer. His fundamental assumptions about gender and capability had been proven catastrophically wrong. Torres delivered the final blow. "Generals, Colonel Webb's discrimination against Captain Hayes wasn't based on performance deficiencies. It was based on prejudice. When she repeatedly outperformed his expectations, he responded with retaliation rather than recognition. This pattern represents exactly the kind of systemic discrimination the Air Force has committed to eliminating." After a brief recess, General Rodriguez returned with the panel's findings. "Colonel Webb, this panel finds clear and convincing evidence that you engaged in discriminatory practices against Captain Hayes based on her gender. Your assignment decisions show a pattern of bias that cannot be explained by operational requirements or performance considerations." Rodriguez paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Furthermore, your attempt to retaliate against Captain Hayes when she demonstrated exceptional capability represents a fundamental failure of leadership and judgment." Webb stood rigidly at attention, but Rebecca could see the defeat in his posture. "Colonel Webb, you are hereby relieved of command, effective immediately. You will be transferred to a non-command position pending further administrative action. A letter of reprimand will be placed in your permanent file, and you are barred from any future command assignments." Rodriguez turned to Rebecca. "Major Hayes, the Air Force formally apologizes for the discrimination you experienced. Your exceptional performance during this investigation period demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership and capability the Air Force needs to maintain our competitive edge." The title Major hit Rebecca like a thunderbolt. Her promotion had been accelerated as part of the resolution. "Major Hayes, you are assigned as Chief Instructor for Electronic Warfare Systems at the Air Force Academy, effective immediately. You will also serve on the Air Force-wide committee developing new anti-discrimination training protocols." As the hearing concluded, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. She'd won completely. Webb's career was destroyed. Her own trajectory was transformed, and the system had been forced to acknowledge its failures. But the victory had come at tremendous personal cost and revealed ugly truths about the organization she'd devoted her life to serving. Outside the hearing room, Foster and Thompson waited nervously. They knew their own careers hung in the balance. Their participation in Webb's discriminatory practices made them liable for administrative action. Foster approached Rebecca with something resembling humility. Major Hayes, I owe you an apology." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "Captain Foster, you don't owe me an apology. You owe the Air Force an explanation for how you forgot that we're all supposed to be on the same side." The next Morning, Rebecca cleaned out her desk while preparing for transfer to Colorado Springs. As she packed her belongings, Chief Master Sergeant Williams knocked on her door. "Major Hayes, congratulations on your promotion. The Air Force is better for what you've done here." Rebecca smiled. "Thank you, Chief. But this was never about me personally. It was about making sure the next woman who walks into that ready room doesn't have to fight the same battles." As she drove away from Nellis for the last time, Rebecca reflected on how completely her world had changed. 6 months ago, she'd been fighting for basic recognition. Now she was heading to one of the Air Force's most prestigious assignments, with a mandate to change the system from within. In her rearview mirror, she could see the base growing smaller, but she wasn't looking back with regret. She was looking forward to the future she'd fought to create, not just for herself, but for every pilot who would follow. 1 year later, Major Rebecca Hayes stood at the podium of the Air Force Academy's Fairchild Hall, addressing a mixed class of cadets whose eager faces reflected the future of military aviation. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity, with observers from across the Air Force who had come to witness the woman whose case had transformed service-wide policies. "Electronic warfare isn't just about technology," Rebecca told her students. "It's about maintaining clarity when chaos reigns, making decisions when information is incomplete, and staying calm when others panic. These skills transcend any single mission. They define what it means to be an effective military leader." In the front row, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams, recently promoted and now Director of Advanced Training Programs, smiled with obvious pride. The investment she'd made in Rebecca's career had paid dividends far beyond what anyone had imagined. After class, Rebecca walked across the academy grounds, still marveling at how much her life had changed. Her office overlooked the Rampart Range, a constant reminder that she'd climbed far higher than anyone had thought possible. On her desk sat 3 items that told the story of her transformation: her original pilot wings from flight school, a commendation letter from General Rodriguez, and a photo from her first class of electronic warfare instructors. 12 officers, 6 of them women. The systemic changes had been swift and comprehensive. Colonel Webb had been quietly retired after serving out his final assignment in a logistics role. Foster had received a letter of reprimand and been transferred to a training squadron where his advancement opportunities were severely limited. Thompson had requested early separation rather than face the investigation into his conduct, but the real victory wasn't in their punishment, it was in the institutional changes that followed. The Hayes Protocol, as it had become known informally, established clear metrics for assignment decisions and required justification for any disparities in career advancement opportunities. More importantly, it created protected channels for reporting discrimination and retaliation. Captain Torres, now Major Torres, had been promoted to Chief of Military Justice at Air Combat Command, where she oversaw implementation of the new anti-discrimination training. Rebecca's case became the template for handling these situations properly, she'd told a recent conference of military lawyers. It showed that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, but only when institutions have the courage to listen. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Major Collins at the Pentagon. "Congressional hearing next week went perfectly. Your testimony about systemic barriers was exactly what they needed to hear. The Air Force is getting additional funding for diversity and inclusion programs specifically because of your case." That evening, Rebecca video-called her mother in Ohio, their weekly tradition since the promotion. Janet Hayes, a retired school principal, had followed every development with fierce maternal pride. "I saw the article in Air Force Times," her mother said, beaming through the screen. "They called you the pilot who changed everything. Your father would be so proud." Rebecca smiled, touching the photo of her father that sat beside her computer. "Mom, I think about what he used to say. That respect is earned, but I've learned something else. Sometimes you have to demand the opportunity to earn it." The most meaningful validation had come from an unexpected source. Last month, she'd received a letter from a young woman at the Air Force Academy. "Major Hayes, I'm a first-year cadet studying aeronautical engineering. When I told my advisor I wanted to be a fighter pilot, she didn't try to talk me out of it. She said if I was half as good as Rebecca Hayes, I'd be fine. I just wanted you to know that because of what you did, girls like me don't have to fight the same battles you fought." But perhaps the most satisfying moment had come 6 months after. Her transfer when she'd received an unexpected visitor. Chief Master Sergeant Williams had driven up from Nellis to Colorado Springs specifically to see her. "Major, I wanted to tell you something," he'd said, sitting in her academy office. "The squadron isn't the same since you left, but it's better. The new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Davidson, runs a tight ship. No tolerance for discrimination, clear assignment criteria, and she specifically seeks out diverse perspectives during mission planning." Williams had paused, choosing his words carefully. "The young pilots coming in now, they don't even think twice about female pilots being in the squadron. It's just normal to them. That's your legacy, ma'am." Rebecca often thought about that legacy as she developed curriculum for the next generation of electronic warfare officers. Her courses were renowned for their technical rigor, but she'd also incorporated lessons about leadership under pressure, maintaining professionalism in hostile environments, and the importance of moral courage. Her students came from diverse backgrounds, men and women, different ethnicities and economic circumstances, but they shared common traits: exceptional ability and determination to excel despite obstacles. In many ways, they reminded her of herself. During a recent symposium on military leadership, a journalist had asked Rebecca if she regretted the conflict at Nellis, given its personal cost. Her response had been immediate and clear. "I regret that the conflict was necessary, but I don't regret fighting it. Every woman who serves after me will face fewer barriers because of that battle." The question that haunted her wasn't about regret, it was about responsibility. What obligation? Did she have to continue fighting for others who might not have her advantages? The answer had shaped her new role beyond just instruction. Rebecca now served on the Air Force Chief of Staff's Advisory Council on Diversity and Inclusion, where she reviewed policies and investigated complaints. It was demanding work, often, requiring her to relive her own experiences through others' struggles, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Just last week, she'd mediated a case involving a Hispanic pilot who was being excluded from advanced training opportunities. The situation was depressingly familiar, but the outcome was different. The complaint was taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and resolved quickly. The pilot received his desired assignment, and his squadron commander received additional training on unconscious bias. "This is what institutional change looks like," Rebecca had told her academy students during a recent ethics seminar. "Not dramatic transformation overnight, but steady progress that makes each generation's service experience better than the last." As autumn settled over Colorado Springs, Rebecca reflected on her improbable journey from marginalized squadron member to nationally recognized leader in military reform. The path had been neither easy nor certain, but it had led to exactly where she was meant to be. That weekend, she received a call that brought everything full circle. Lieutenant Jessica Park, the daughter of Technical Sergeant Lisa Park from Nellis, had been accepted to the Air Force Academy and would begin the following year. "Major Hayes," the young woman said, "my mom told me I should call you. She said you changed everything for women in the Air Force." Rebecca smiled, remembering Lisa's support during those difficult days at Nellis. "Jessica, your mother was one of the people who helped me find the courage to fight back. I'm honored to know you'll be continuing that tradition." "Ma'am, I want to be a pilot, and I want to be as good as you." "Jessica, you don't need to be as good as me. You need to be better than me. That's how progress works." After ending the call, Rebecca walked onto her office balcony and looked up at the clear Colorado sky. Somewhere up there, pilots were training for missions that would keep America safe. Some of them were women who would never face the barriers she'd encountered, never have to choose between speaking up and staying silent, never have to prove their worth twice for every recognition. They would fly because they were capable, advance because they excelled, and lead because they were ready. And they would do it all in an Air Force that had been forced to examine its conscience and emerge stronger for the scrutiny. Rebecca had started as one woman fighting an unfair system. She'd ended as the catalyst for institutional change that would benefit thousands. The girl who'd learned to swallow her pride with her morning coffee had become the woman who taught others that pride was worth fighting for. She thought about Colonel Webb's question from that day in his office, "Are you questioning my judgment?" The answer then had been carefully diplomatic. The answer now was simpler. She hadn't questioned his judgment. She'd proven it wrong. The sky belonged to everyone who earned their place in it. Rebecca Hayes had made sure of that. In her final log entry that evening, she wrote, "They told me to let the real pilots handle it. Turns out I was one of the real pilots all along. The difference was, I never stopped believing that, even when everyone else did." The story ended where it began, with a pilot who knew her worth, trusted her training, and refused to let anyone else define her limits. But this time she wasn't flying alone. She was leading a formation of those who would follow, and the sky was wide enough for all of them. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our everyday life. Stories community, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.